Most people, when they imagine the time Jesus lived in, picture a spiritual scene, sandals, sermons, miracles, moral teachings, as if everything existed inside a sacred haze, detached from ordinary time. But for the people who were actually living then, life didn't move that way. What shaped their world wasn't theology, it was money, or more precisely, the absence of it. The era Jesus was born into was embedded in one of the most unequal economic systems the Mediterranean world had ever seen. And this system didn't form by accident. At the beginning of the 1st century, Judea was part of the Roman Empire, but calling it a part is almost too innocent. Rome didn't conquer lands to develop them, it conquered them to feed the center. The edges of the empire existed to funnel wealth inward. Grain, silver, labor, all of it flowed toward Rome. Judea was one of those edges. The problem was simple. Judea wasn't wealthy. It wasn't full of major trade cities. It was fragile, agricultural, and mostly rural. People weren't farmers in the modern sense. They were small producers with just enough land to survive. One bad harvest didn't mean lower profits, it meant hunger. And Rome didn't care. Power was shared between local elites and Roman officials. Kings like Herod ruled with Roman approval. Later, governors like Pontius Pilate oversaw the region. Their task wasn't to raise living standards, it was to keep order and make sure revenue kept flowing. Taxes were the backbone of the system, but not like modern taxes. There were no income-based adjustments, no concern for profit or loss. In Judea, you paid taxes because you existed. Land tax, produce tax, head tax, tolls on roads and markets, and on top of all that, religious taxes. They stacked relentlessly. What happened if you couldn't pay? No one listened. Tax collection was outsourced to local contractors. These men paid Rome up front, then extracted as much as possible from the population. Harshness wasn't a flaw. It was the system working as designed. If you didn't have the money, you borrowed. Debt was everywhere, but it wasn't like modern debt. There was no bankruptcy, no restructuring. Interest accumulated fast, and land was the collateral. A single bad year could drag an entire family into a swamp they'd never escape. The pattern was almost always the same. Crops were planted, weather turned, the harvest failed. Taxes were still demanded, debt was taken on, interest piled up. The next year might be slightly better, but the debt remained. Eventually, the land was seized. You became a tenant on what used to be your own property, or a day labourer, or you disappeared altogether. This wasn't accidental. It was structural. Land steadily concentrated in fewer hands. Large estates swallowed small plots. Elites tied to Rome and the temple grew stronger, while the majority sank into insecurity. The economy didn't just create poverty, it reproduced it endlessly, and there was no social safety net. Lose your land and there was no state to catch you. Family was the only protection. Charity existed, but it was limited. When the system collapsed, charity couldn't hold it up. Debt wasn't only financial, it was social. When land was lost, status vanished, identity vanished, the future vanished. This was the world Jesus was born into, and it needs to be said clearly, people weren't poor because they were lazy. They weren't poor because they were sinful. They were poor because the system required them to be. Rome needed surplus, local elites needed rents, the temple needed revenue. All that pressure landed on those with the least margin for error. That pressure produced something else, tension. Judea wasn't quiet. It was constantly simmering. Revolts, banditry, movements promising salvation. These don't emerge in abundance. They emerge in collapse. So when people heard talk of debt forgiveness, freedom and justice, they weren't hearing metaphors. They were hearing a chance at survival. The word forgiveness didn't mean emotional relief. It meant cancelled debt. And this is where the temple comes into focus. Today we imagine the temple as purely a place of worship. But in that era, it was also a bank, a treasury, a tax authority. Every adult Jewish man was required to pay the temple tax. It had to be paid in a specific silver coin. That meant exchanging money and paying exchange fees. Sacrificial animals had to be purchased. Even the poor couldn't escape the system. The temple elite were deeply entangled with Roman power. High priests weren't chosen by the people but approved politically. Order mattered more than justice. So the institution that claimed to represent holiness was also part of the machinery that crushed people. The public saw this. The problem wasn't faith, it was hypocrisy. Jesus didn't speak outside this system. He spoke directly into it. He talked about debt, labor, wages, because that was everyday life. When he overturned the tables in the temple, it wasn't just religious anger. It was a challenge to the idea that access to the sacred could be bought. That's what truly disturbed power. Rome tolerated teachers. It tolerated criticism. What it didn't tolerate was instability, especially during Passover, when crowds filled Jerusalem. The issue wasn't theology. It was legitimacy. Jesus wasn't trying to overthrow Rome, but he said debt wasn't destiny. He said poverty wasn't a moral failure. And that is dangerous to empires. What followed is well known. Revolts, siege, the destruction of the temple. The system hardened, taxes increased, land concentrated further. Rome won, but it never fully controlled the story. The alternative moral vision Jesus spoke of lived on in small communities. Sharing, mutual aid, relief from debt. These weren't revolutions, they were parallel logics. Rome controlled territory, but it never fully controlled meaning. And maybe that's the real lesson. Systems don't collapse simply because they're unjust. They collapse when people stop believing the stories that justify them. Suffering can be sustained, but belief that suffering is necessary cannot. Once you see this, you start to recognize why the stories power tells always sound familiar, and it becomes much harder to believe they're innocent. History carries many layers and tells us many things. What matters is whether we notice them. For more, subscribe, and let's become aware together.